up, everyone? I am Raj Chander here with my awesome co-host Chris Jackson. We are the CANiVISION Policy Report, newly launched coverage of all things political, things that are happening both at a federal and statewide level in cannabis, all the good stuff you need to know about across lifestyle, business, and medical verticals of the industry. I myself am a cannabis policy journalist. I've been covering the field for about 2.5 years now. I've contributed at Leafly, Cannabis Business Times, Dope Magazine. Also marketing coordinator here at Peak Relief, which is a medical cannabis dispensary in the Rockville, Maryland area. Shout out Montgomery County. And looking forward to rocking it with you guys and talking more about what's going on and just, giving some updates on, I think, an area of the industry that not a lot of people, frankly, are super in tune with, at least on a really detailed level. So I'm excited to be here. Chris, say what's up and tell us a little bit about yourself, man.
No doubt. Chris Jackson here. Happy to be here, having conversations that, to your point, people may not be having or in a way that we plan on having them. But I am born and raised in Michigan. I former candidate for city council and state representative, now part owner of Sticky Cannabis Operations. We have multiple dispensaries and getting vertically integrated in the near future. I am also a board member for the National Cannabis Industry Association. We bring a variety of different perspectives, and then obviously the lead production for CANiVISION Midwest, Raj, lead production in Southeast Michigan, and so we plan on bringing it all together. So happy to be here, man.
Yeah, definitely, and you're right. Thank you for adding that in. We do one of the cool things that you and I talked about privately was how we can have some different perspectives, right? Because I'm the Southeast region lead, but I live right out here in DC, and you are really tuned in with Michigan and the Midwest stuff kind of going on out there. So I think we'll have some cool differing viewpoints and different angles of stories that are affecting the whole industry. And on that note, we have one story that has affected the entire industry, the passing of the MORE Act. As most of you listening to this probably know, the House did pass the MORE Act. And so that was a historic moment in cannabis. It descheduled not only did it deschedule cannabis, but it also had some reinvestments, some money that was going to be going into the communities that are harmed most by prohibition and the war on drugs. But there was also some problems with it, right, Chris? I mean, we had talked a little bit about that too.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think we'll do in all cases is take a look at the good, the bad, the ugly, who the winners and losers are in every situation, right?
Sure.
In this case, big win for the cannabis industry in its entirety. The MORE Act, marijuana opportunities, expungement,
reinvestment and expungement. I know it took me a while too.
Yeah. So in everything that the act says is actually in the title, in the acronym, right? So the descheduling piece of it obviously is a huge deal for people who were previously impacted by the war on drugs. Putting money, a percentage of the money from products towards racial, social justices, criminal specific programs is also a big deal. And the authors of the act should be congratulated for that piece. To your point,
so that's the good.
That's the good. Right? That's the good. The bad of it is that there was a provision and or a amendment that was added that basically says that if you were formally convicted as a felon having to do with cannabis, or even if you were investigated as a related to cannabis, then you don't have an opportunity to actually participate in the industry, which had everyone up in arms, and rightfully so, right? Now, we happen to know now that there were some conversations about actually getting the bill passed and then going through different iterations of the bill that would actually take that provision out because it was simply just a carbon copy of other types of industries, tobacco, alcohol, where they have those types of provisions in them. I just happen to know that Blumenauer and Lee, Congress folks, who are the chairs of the Cannabis Caucus, actually have it in pretty good confidence that the cannabis community's concerns will be heard in the next session, right? So I think for those who dig a bit deeper, they'll see where the provision ultimately came from and that it's not there to stay. But I also commend the people who made some noise about it, because there are some folks who are being more strategic so far as relationships are concerned, but there are others who are out in front saying, look, this is an issue. This is a problem. We need to resolve it. And if history has taught us nothing different, you need to make some noise in order to make sure that certain promises are met, right? And so that was the bad of it, if you will. You know what I mean?
We continue to see this is another battle in a longer war that has been playing out in the industry for several years between, a lot of the folks that are straight industry advocates, people like the MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project, even to some degree the NCIA. These are guys who are all about like industry progress and taking steps and passing the bills. And then on the other hand, you have some folks that may not be as thrilled about it, and places I believe the M4MM, Minorities for Medical Marijuana, came out against the bill, as has the MCBA, the Minority Cannabis Business Association. So it's sort of it's always an interesting disparity to me to see where the lines get drawn. And of course, it's not black and white. The NTIA has done a ton with cannabis equity and diversity and all that. I think there's always shades of gray when you're talking about something as complex as cannabis legalization. But just to the first thing that what you were talking about made me think of, Chris, was how it sort of draws a line between people. And frankly, I think where we're at now, that can be a harmful thing, because we don't want to be, there's still so much work left to do that we don't want to be, broken into little factions as a group. I think it's best if we can all team up and work together from every side of the industry to really fight for the things that we need and the things that everybody knows we need from a policy perspective.
And is there such thing as a perfect bill ever? Right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's what's going to be the fallout in all of this. Is that there is no such thing. No one is going to be completely happy, right? It's the job of certain people in certain organizations to continue to fight for the things that they believe that certain communities need more than others, right?
Right.
And then there's another side that's catering maybe more so to the stakeholders or the latest corporate stakeholders, right? Just by way of the position that they take in their own, politics and political beliefs. And so, you have four corners of government, right? In the Congress, in the federal government for this case. And you have, and I'm talking about House and Senate Democrats, House and Senate Republicans.
Right.
And in those four corners, cannabis is not a top 3 priority, I don't think, for either party.
Yeah.
And so if cannabis isn't a priority for either party or in any of these four corners, sure, they'll do what they can to progress the movement along, but it's not going to happen in a way that we all would like it to see happen because COVID, healthcare, and economics are at the top of their agenda, and it doesn't necessarily mean that cannabis is at the forefront. How do we expect a bill to ever be what we personally ever really want it to be if it's not the priority of the people that are ultimately constructing the legislation, right? And that's the piece of it I think everyone either understands but still has a role to play, or doesn't understand, and we need to start to educate from that perspective. You know what I mean?
You're right. Continuing on to off of your point, I mean, everybody pretty much saw, even if you weren't kind of closely following the vote, you probably saw Republicans that were like, there's the biggest pandemic in a century and people are suffering, but the Democrats are forcing the vote on weed. They're just, it's all about pot for them. Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, all this stuff. So you were talking about the people in charge not being concerned about it. So that really made me, brought that directly to mind, was like, they've been criticized for it, but again, as we've seen, the numbers don't back up those criticisms, right? Like, now a super majority of Americans favor legalization. New Jersey just passed cannabis legalization overwhelmingly. We saw all the ballot measures in the previous election passed, and it's not really based on anything. It's just political infighting, which of course we have plenty of here in DC, but that's probably a podcast for another day.
Yeah, plenty of it here in Michigan even. So I think it's a little bit everywhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think for me, as I see it, and I'd love to have you chime in too, Chris. Like, for me, the ugly part is just the fact that we have different people kind of turning against each other in the industry, and the more devious issue is that you're not going to get up as much for something that you don't really feel super strongly about. People aren't going to really put their full weight, put their voice, put their actions behind a bill that they don't think is perfect. Like you said, to your point, what is a perfect bill? Are you willing to say, okay, this isn't perfect, but you know what? I'm still going to be an advocate for this bill regardless, because I want to bring the industry forward. And to me, that's the ugly part, is that it's sort of put a damper on how much momentum you can have when there's a whole segment of the industry that really aren't supporters of the bill.
The encouraging thing, I think, is that it gives states a framework to be able to work from, right? So, I'm afraid of the federal government coming into states and saying things like, hey, now we're in control, and,
Right.
this legislation that you need to have, when you've had a state like Michigan, for instance, and California before it, but Michigan that's had some type of regulatory framework since 2014 or 15, right?
Right.
And so my hope is that there's a collaborative effort from the federal government to say, okay, states still have a sense of independence so long as they work in these frameworks that come from the MORE Act or whatever legislation is built from the MORE
Right.
Act. On the CANiVISION Midwest podcast, I actually had state representative, Michigan State Representative Yusuf Rabi on, and
Cool.
we had a conversation about how the MORE Act actually impacts the state of Michigan. And one of the things that came out of Michigan was a clean slate bill package that would ultimately include cannabis, but didn't specifically call out cannabis. It was an important start, but what the MORE Act does is it gives legitimacy to the Michigan state legislator and every other legislator for that matter now to actually pursue an expungement bill package, to actually pursue an equity model, right? I mean, it gives that it's okay from the federal government that states feel more comfortable with making it more equitable and correcting the issues from the war on drugs.
That's a great point, what you brought up, and that's been a huge thing in the current phase of the fight for legalization and descheduling, is the state model. We've seen that every state has done it slightly differently, and it's interesting because some of the states are really far ahead in some areas, but really lagging behind in other areas. So, like, you look at, for example, a state like Colorado, which is one of the biggest state industries in the country and one of the oldest, and they're known as like the mature cannabis industry, and they're viewed as a model. But then when you look underneath, I think they had a survey that was like maybe like 8% minority ownership of businesses in Denver and Colorado, and specifically African American ownership was something like 4%. And they just now, I believe, announced this year in 2020 that they're going to start doing social equity licenses. So it's like, whereas places like you guys out there in Michigan have kind of been in that game and been working on that from the beginning, so I love what you brought up about the state model. And I think you're right. The MORE Act really does a good job in the sense that it says, this is what we need to reinvest in. This is what you should be looking at, and sort of encouraging states to emulate that on their own on a state by state model.
No one has done it perfectly yet anyway, right? There's room for
Of
improvement
course.
across the board,
Yep.
including in Michigan, right? Illinois did a bit better. The thing about the MORE Act is, indeed, it's just an act, right? So when it says um, providing funds, grant, and aid to communities, specifically, that suffered from the war on drugs, like, you have to flesh out what that actually means, right? So,
Right.
so that's going to be, I think, where the issues are going to come in with
Sure.
regard to the act, because the legislative framework isn't built around it yet, and so you're going to have everybody's interpretation of what they believe that language actually means,
Right.
and that's going to be an entirely different hurdle to get over, because you have, even within each party, more liberal and more conservative folks, right, or more moderate.
Yep.
That's the thing that I think is going to become the larger conversation. And there's already a sense of division right now, to your point,
Yep.
amongst stakeholders in the industry. Imagine what's going to happen when we finally get to the table and they have to define what that language actually means. And so
Yeah.
I'm really hopeful that the federal government puts together a task force from stakeholders from all over the country. Hopefully, my perspective: too many chefs in the kitchen, things going to get done, right?
Yeah.
But enough people and enough stakeholders where they can actually speak to the folks who are involved in the industry directly. For instance, the Biden administration, and would love your thoughts. The Biden administration has signaled rescheduling versus descheduling, even though Vice President-elect Kamala Harris kept trumpeting the word descheduling, right? So there's a disconnect there. What does rescheduling actually means? So if you reschedule from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 2 or 3, to where it can be researched by pharmaceutical, the only winners in that, in a lot of ways, are the doctors, right, that want to control the industry anyway. So what are your thoughts on rescheduling versus descheduling?
Well, I think the first thing I'll respond to is, you brought up the Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. I think an interesting side detail that isn't brought up enough is that she was actually the sponsor of the bill last summer in the Senate. And so to me, it's been kind of a little bit ironic to see that, she sponsored one of the most progressive cannabis bills that we've ever seen in the history of Congress, that does all this towards, progressive investments, reinvesting in community funds, was a staunch proponent of legalizing all through her campaign and while she was, running in the Democratic primaries. Then once she got the VP nod, we saw her stance kind of shifted in line with Joe Biden's, which has been from, basically from the time that he announced hasn't shifted too much. He's always said nobody should be in jail for cannabis. We should study the effects. We should decriminalize. But, he's stopped short of full federal legalization. So, on the one hand, I think that's my first interesting point, is that, we see where Kamala is almost like to the center now of her own bill, which is pretty interesting phenomenon. Of course, something that does happen in politics. To answer the broader question, I think if there's been anything at all that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have shown, it's been flexibility. Go back onto the C-SPAN archives and look at some of Biden's old speeches about, the drug war. And I mean, he's railing into people. He was using prohibition and harsher drug laws and all that kind of stuff as a tool to as a political instrument being wielded to fight against Republicans. So from that, we've seen him progress all the way over. Well, not quite all the way over, but almost all the way over from where he was. And, I just outlined Kamala Harris's shift as well. So to me, the one thing that Harris and Biden have shown everybody is that they have some fluidity. They aren't set in stone on any specific policy. And, to be frank, like any good politician, they're going to go with the wave of what's going on? America is overwhelmingly in support of legalization. I think we can see them shift to possibly going towards full legalization. I don't know for sure. It's just my prediction, but I think in the past they've shown that fluidity and they've shown a willingness to move on almost every position, particularly this one. And so I think there is some optimism, but also I think a lot of it depends on the Senate runoffs too, which we have in Georgia that are coming up soon. And that will be for control of the Senate. So, I'd love to hear your take too, but I don't see a situation where if we have a Democratic Senate and we have, a House that's already passed the bill and we have now a Democratic Senate that is willing to take up the MORE Act, I don't really see Biden and Harris administration objecting to something that the rest of the party wants to pass.
And the alternative is true as well. The Senate is still predominantly red. A president has to understand how to work with both sides, right, in order to get accomplished ultimately, right? It's just the nature of politics, the nature of democracy, generally speaking. Republicans do maintain the Senate. I do believe rescheduling will be what's being touted because that's an easier pill for some ultra conservatives to swallow, right? Versus enacting complete descheduling. The opposite is true, though, to your point, assuming that it is a blue win in Georgia, then descheduling, I think, becomes more prominent. And so rarely has there been a fight for an industry specifically, right? Not that I can remember, but a defining race or two races within the same state that could ultimately dictate what the future of cannabis looks like for the next 4 years. What's going to end up happening is, do we get to legalization sooner rather than later? And then if rescheduling happens versus descheduling, then what impact does rescheduling have on what the eventual full legalization is going to look like? And that's going to be the thing that we need to watch really closely as stakeholders in the industry, because the outcome is going to be very different depending on if descheduling versus rescheduling happens within the next 4 years or the first term of the Biden administration.
For sure. And I think there's been, to just continue on that point, there's been debate on both sides. I think a lot of it, from my knowledge, a lot of the question is, or the concern is that if it's descheduled completely and just like left unregulated, then that restricts the ability of the government to do research on cannabis and find out more about it. It's a nuanced thing, because some people will say like, oh well, why does the DEA have to schedule it all? Why even keep it on the schedule? Part of that is due to research, so that the government can have a role in that, and in terms of leading the way about studying the plant, finding new cannabinoids, finding out new potential compounds that we may not even know exist. Because, just stepping out of policy a little bit, like just from a scientific perspective, there's so much about the plant that we still don't know. I mean, we do have a lot of research in the past, but it's definitely a very gray argument. Like I was saying, it's tough to just draw a line on one side or the other, because there's nuance to it. There's a lot of moving parts, and you're right. I think it's going to change depending on what happens after this election, and depending on what happens in Congress in general.
And to take that thought a step further, why not allow the states to do the research?
Yeah.
And then accumulate the data, right? Like, why does it have to be the federal government that's controlling that research ultimately versus just relying on the states, accumulating the data, and then coming to some thought process after the fact or in conjunction with the states, which is something I don't know has been a conversation.
Oh yeah, sure. I think when it comes to that, like the more the better, like I think the not to use a pun there, but the more the better when it comes to like research and scientific studies and that kind of thing. Like, the federal government has, before this administration, to not make any political statements, but let's just say prior to this administration, the federal government has kind of led the way in terms of like, healthcare research, infectious diseases. But you're absolutely right. Like, I think that in some cases, it needs to be, in many cases, in fact, it needs to be driven by the state at a state level. Yeah, I totally agree. I think we need as much as possible state, federal, municipal, county, city level, like all these players should be having their own scientific studies, research studies, and also to your point earlier, their policy studies, looking at the model ordinances, looking at some of the laws that have actually been put in place in states like Michigan, New Jersey, Illinois, and just seeing like what's been done and what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and I think that was one of the big criticisms of the New Jersey bill, was that it clearly, in its original form, it clearly hadn't taken input from what had worked and what hadn't worked previously. So,
and I did a keynote for the latest NCIA conference with Michigan Agency Director Andrew Brisboe. Mm-hmm. And part of his conversation, and I encourage other agency leads, is to acknowledge that it's not going as well as you had predicted it would have gone when you started it, right? And he was very candid in saying, like, you know what, while I thought it was a good start, or I thought it was a good idea, here we are a year and a half later, and it's not what I anticipated it would be. Numbers don't lie, right? So numbers are reflecting that only 3% or 4% of ownership in the cannabis industry are people of color. Then your social equity lens or program that you put together isn't doing as well as you originally thought it would. So, right. And that's okay as long as you're willing to adjust. And he's one of those people who outwardly said, hey, I'm willing to adjust. That needs to be a conversation across the board now, right? Are we willing to adjust, and how can we be better versus the ego getting involved and you not wanting to have a red mark against you, I guess, for effort. Because people will ultimately appreciate and remember the changes that were made, right? Versus someone staying starch about what they believe in their approach and how they go about doing it.
Fortunately, I don't think everybody is like that, but we need more. We need more of those. So hopefully, more of those kinds of folks will get involved at again, like I was saying, every level: the federal, state, city, municipal, all that kind of stuff. So, Chris, do you have any final thoughts or predictions, and then also, talk about what we want to bring with future episodes of the CANiVISION policy report?
I got out of the business of trying to predict what's going to happen a long time ago, right? As far as like what's going to happen specifically in Georgia, I don't know enough, right? And maybe what we can do is we can have someone on from Georgia to shed some light and give us some perspective as to what's going on in that state. But our goal with the CANiVISION policy report is really to have candid conversation around what's happening, what's going to happen, really understanding each state's perspective, politically especially, and really having folks from all over the country who are elected, who deal with policy, who are activists and or advocates that can shed some light to the things that are going on in all of the states as we inch closer to decriminalization and full cannabis legalization in the United States. And so really looking forward to being a part of this movement.
That's awesome, man. And same for me. I think you nailed it. Where we are right now as an industry is very patchwork. It's a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different organizations and regulatory bodies. There are challenges and problems that brings up. But I also think from a media perspective, it really allows us to get some broader perspectives on the industry, and like you said, get folks from all around the country. There's a lot of sides to the industry. I'm really excited to be working on this with you and the rest of the CANiVISION team, man. I think it's going to be super dope, and really, really happy to continue to bring that diversity in perspective.
Thanks for having us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of CANiVISION Policy Report.
Heck yeah, we'll see you guys next time.